Hello, friends, and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, May 3rd, 2023. I'm Jer Stays, sharing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. And today's topic is a lot about what to know, because we're talking about the plight of our state's small cities, personified by Highland Park, where the news is focused right now. But all over Michigan, a number of cities just aren't big enough and don't have big enough tax bases to be able to support themselves. Now, Highland Park has been in and out of financial troubles for quite a number of years. But this paragraph in a piece that Eric Lupher, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan and our guest today, this paragraph kind of caught my eye. Whether a solution to the current financial crisis is adopted through the courts, the emergency manager process, or facilitated by state officials, it is likely that the solution will slap another Band-Aid on the city's finances and prop it up for a few more years. Ultimately, state and local government officials must choose between dissolving the city to make it part of Detroit or adopting an urban agenda to help places like Highland Park prosper again. So what are some solutions? What's the problem at hand? What can we do about it? Here's my conversation with Eric Lupher. Welcome back to Daily Detroit.
It is always good to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. You have a very interesting piece in your blog, and it's, I think, very pertinent to talk about. It says, bankruptcy will not solve Highland Park's financial problems. But if you read on, it's also about the plight of a number of small and kind of, in some ways, kind of locked in cities. And I think that it's something that to talk about and some lessons we can learn from Highland Park. But before we get started, let's kind of set the table. Highland Park is not in a great financial position right now. And why is that?
It depends on what you look at. Highland Park, of course, has been declining in population for years. And as Ford and then Chrysler moved out, it lost what was once a very rich tax base. And over the years, it's gone into, in Michigan, we call it an emergency manager process, where the state comes in and helps the local government get back on its feet and point it in the right direction. But since it exited that process for the last time in 2018, it has been in pretty good financial condition. When you look at the audits and the financial statements, revenues have been in excess of expenditures, and debt has been coming down to the conventional debt. But all the while, the city of Highland Park has been in contention with the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, and then post-bankruptcy that got handed off to the Great Lakes Water Authority. And through all that contention, the sewage bills weren't being paid to the other entities. And that lawsuit has finally run its course. The state Supreme Court said, this is done. It's time to be done with this. And it turns out the city has an estimated $24 million of debt that it needs to come up with. Considering all the money it brings in on an annual basis is only $20 million, and that's needed to pay the police and fire and, the accountants and everything else. It doesn't leave any money to pay $24 million or even much to go for it. So on the one hand, you can look at the city and say, well, you seem to be on the right track. You're doing all the right things. But then there's this, I call it the elephant in the room, but it's really the elephant in the phone booth. It's a huge debt for such a small city.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that it's very contentious among different communities in Metro Detroit. There have been a lot of press statements, things like that, where, somebody needs to pay it, the state needs to come in and pay it. But the bottom line is that in order for this to get handled, it looks like it may push Highland Park into bankruptcy. And you kind of go into a little bit more talking about like insolvency for smaller cities. And why is that?
Michigan has not been growing as a state, and therefore we're just shuffling people around the state. We're continuing to have urban sprawl and high tax places losing population to lower tax places. And it puts a financial strain on us in total as a state, all the population. It puts a stress on it, and the recourse is taxes. And you can say tax is a 3-letter word. Tax, most people think of tax as a 4-letter word, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes. But at the same time, we've built in this inefficient system of local government where we let our cities mostly and villages that are 1, 2, 3 square miles in a lot of places. Highland Park has a population of 8,900, 8,700. For the things that we expect our local governments to do, it is hard to come up with the money to be able to afford everything and do it right at such a small unit of government. And in the world of economics, we call it economies of scale or economies of skill, that you have to buy a fire truck, you have to build a library, you have to hire a professional assessor or accountant. And it's hard to afford those things with such a small tax base, which means you have to tax at a very high level to do it, which makes people not want to live there. Highland Park is the obvious example at hand, but you can look all throughout Michigan in our urban and our rural places and find examples of this. And, we can go on doing what we've been doing and continue to complain about taxes and continue to complain about inefficiencies, or we can finally recognize this and say, why do we still have a Highland Park? It was once the home to Ford and Chrysler, as I say, in a very rich place. It had its own community college. It had its own well-run system of local government. But if it doesn't have that anymore, what does it take to buffer it up and keep it doing the things we want it to do?
One challenge politically with that is that, especially, at least I found in Metro Detroit, I can't speak for the rest of the state, there is a lot of political pride in having very small suburbs, very small municipalities. You can look throughout Metro Detroit, and a lot of the suburbs are the size of neighborhoods in other cities and other areas. And it's something that it becomes more of an issue when you aren't growing, because the thing is that everything starts costing more no matter what, right? Inflation, everything else. But you have a lot of municipalities, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that basically haven't changed population, haven't significantly grown in years, yet the bills keep going up.
You're right on about that. And the politics is tough, right? So Governor Whitmer has before her some really hard decisions. Highland Park is filed to go into the emergency manager process again. Governor Whitmer campaigned against that when she was a legislator. She voted against those bills. The city says it wants to jump straight to bankruptcy. I think it's very difficult for her to allow the city to go into bankruptcy on her watch. And as I said, most things are going well, but for this huge debt. But then, so how do you pay the bills? It's very difficult. It's either going to be putting the bill on the people of Highland Park, and that's likely to push more people out of the city, sharing the bill among the Great Lakes Water Authority, and already the other communities that have been supporting Highland Park are complaining about it, and that will get louder if that's the choice, or do it across all of Michigan, and that doesn't seem like a great choice. So the politics are really hard. And then when you start talking about should these governments be here, people, when you have that small of a government, people feel a little more connected, right? They feel City Hall is within walking distance, and I know my city council member, I went to school with them, there's this sense of community, but it's inefficient, and you can't have it both ways. So we have to decide, do we want that closeness to government, or do we want to find ways to be more efficient and become more attractive? It's kind of hard with Highland Park because the alternative is to fold it into Detroit, and Detroit has not for a long time been confused with an efficient government, but it is at least more sustainable as they come out of bankruptcy and things appear to be getting better.
Yeah, there's kind of economies of scale there. And also, let's just be honest, there is a psychological draw to Detroit that brings in money, foundation resources, things like that a town of 8,900 or whatever, under 9,000 just doesn't have, right? Like Detroit has a story, Highland Park has a story, but it's not a national story that people are as interested in.
And living in Detroit shadows, is really hard because the economic development efforts, the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation is worried about Detroit. If it finds a company interested in coming in, it's not going to say, oh, but wait, our friendly neighbor over here, Highland Park, needs growth too. Wayne County has the efforts and, it's going to do what it can. But again, Detroit is here needing a lot of growth. And at the state level, if you're bringing somebody in and they say, well, I see all the benefits of being in the Detroit area, it's tough to single out Highland Park. Living in Detroit shadows really works against the city when once that was the draw for the city. It was this enclave that was a special place to be while you were surrounded by Detroit. And as times have changed, now it's working against the city in a lot of ways.
What are a couple of options from a practical standpoint to help address these kinds of issues? Because this isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's clear that this won't be the last. I know that sometimes politicians aren't so great at pulling together structural fixes, but what are a couple structural fixes we could look at?
The least intrusive option that we can look at is to farm out a lot of the services that Highland Park relies on. Inherent in having this structure where we have all these small units of government is everyone sort of does it themselves. And if you think about the business model, think about a McDonald's or a Wendy's or think about a lot of other businesses, we sort of have the franchise model, right? Where you hire people locally and the product gets provided locally, but there's a sort of chain of command where corporate handles things. So instead of having Highland Park do everything themselves, what could Wayne County be doing? What could the state be doing? Where's opportunities for more collaboration between Detroit and Highland Park? So there's a lot of opportunities for savings there. It doesn't directly affect the debt that the city has, and we have to figure that out. On the other end of the spectrum is making Highland Park go away and folding it in. So there's a lot you can do between that least obtrusive way and making the city go away, but it's all very hard politically. Nothing can be forced on the city. Ultimately, it's a vote of the city, and you can make it enticing to them in some way. You can offer some carrots for doing some things, but we've set up a system where the governor can't unilaterally say, I'm going to get rid of a city or a school district or anything else like that. So very tough politics.
Yeah, I mean, and home rule is extremely strong in Michigan, and that's part of what stopped the physical footprint expansion of the city of Detroit. Kind of when that came in, people don't realize that the last time that Detroit was this population in 1910, the city border only went to Highland Park. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was part of the whole thing of like, we're going to keep our own identity and all those kind of things. And home rule became something later on that that's why Detroit kind of is capped at 8 Mile in a lot of ways.
Yeah. When you look at the history of Detroit's expansion, the cities that are along its border, whether you look at 8 Mile on the northern side or Redford Township or Dearborn as Detroit was expanding, a lot of those suburbs were afraid of being gobbled up, and they rushed to the courthouse to become a city. And so we have the townships, which are 6 by 6, have incorporated a city. So you look at Southfield or Warren or Livonia, they look like a township, right? They're square on a map. And that's a relic of them rushing to the courthouse and saying, we want to become a city before Detroit comes along and wants to annex us and make it part of what they're doing. So yeah, home rule is good in a lot of ways. We don't need a single, people in Lansing trying to decide what's best for everybody from Monroe up to Houghton. There's a lot of diversity and people should be choosing what's best for them. But sometimes it gets in the way for making these hard decisions and trying to figure out how to do things better.
I think maybe I will kind of leave with this point, maybe this idea. How important would it be to start a situation where we actually started having net growth in Michigan for population and for things like that, and for Metro Detroit. I mean, I know that you can point at the 10 counties and certain things like that, but when you're talking about the issues that we're dealing here, a lot of them are in, the inner counties of Metro Detroit, or what I like to call the tri-county area. How important would it be to start adding population again in a serious manner?
Oh, it's hugely important. We have not grown as a state for 50 years now. The last time we were growing at the same pace as the national average was back at the 1970 census. And since then, the U.S. population has continued to grow, and we have been not at the exact same number, but it not grown at all. During that time, we've gone from 19 representatives in Congress down to 13. So we're losing our political sway on a national level. And economically, we're losing income relative. We're poorer now than we once were relative to the rest of the nation. And all that matters economically because you want businesses to come in and locate here. So they want to look and say, are there people capable of working in our shop? Are they educated? Do they have the skills able to do the things that they need to do? You want stores to come in and sell to us. We don't want to buy everything off of Amazon. We want stores in some way, but if there's not a customer base, then it's not very attractive. So, yeah, growing economically, growing our population as a state, but Detroit and Highland Park and Southeast Michigan, it's hugely important, and we got to get this figured out, stop treading water and making some real changes so that people think about Michigan as a place that they want to come to after graduation and start a family and make a living. We've really been hurting for a lot of years and can't keep on doing what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that listeners might have some ideas. dailydetroit@gmail.com. Or if you've got feelings about the Highland Park situation, are you living in a small city dealing with some of these issues? I'd love to hear about it. Eric, we could do a whole episode on strategies and policies that, involve bringing people back to Michigan and growing population. But I think I might have to save that for another day.
Yeah, we're actually working on a series of papers that we're going to put out very soon that are dealing with that issue. So,
oh, really?
I encourage people to come to our website, crcmich.org, to learn about what we said about Highland Park, but also come here over the next couple of weeks and months to see these papers. And we're going to deal with explaining both the demographics of it, but how has our economy suffered? How's the health of our population suffered? How do we get our arms around the infrastructure that makes us an attractive place that people want to be? And all of that starts with funding government. And so it comes back to what we've just been talking about, creating efficiencies and doing the things we have to do to invest in ourselves.
Well, Eric, I look forward to those future conversations and all that stuff. I'll be sure to link to everything you're talking about in the show notes. Eric Lupher, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I appreciate your time. And until next time, sir.
It's always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And we are done for today. Thank you so much for listening. And thanks to our members at patreon.com/Daily Detroit for helping this thing go. Tomorrow, Robin Runyon from Urbanize Detroit joins me. Looking forward to it, talking all things development, as well as some interesting details about the new transit center that is going in at the State Fairgrounds. I had a chance to head out there and take a look. All right, with that, I am Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.